I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know when or where I got this graphics card from. The other day, I was looking through a box of old motherboard expansion cards and I found this, the Nvidia 6200A. Back in April of 2005 when this card released, the price from Nvidia was $129 for a 128MB version and $149 for a 256MB version. It was marketed as a low-end GPU with entry-level performance and it competed with ATI cards such as the Radeon X300 and X600 Pro. A thing that really struck me as unique about this card was its many different versions with differing bus widths, amount of RAM, and expansion slot compatibilities. For example, all the initial 6200 variants from Nvidia had a 128-bit bus, but the AIB partners were eventually able to develop lower-cost 64-bit versions. The reference clocks for Nvidia's 6200 GPUs were 300 MHz on the core and 275 MHz on the memory, unless it's the DDR version which came clocked to 550 MHz. However, the one I'll be testing today wasn't from Nvidia, but rather from BFG Technologies. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never really heard of this company, probably because, according to Wikipedia, on May 21st, 2010, Josh Levin, the chairman of BFG Technologies, announced they would no longer be developing graphics cards as it was no longer profitable for them. So today we'll be taking a look at a 15-year-old budget graphics card from a company that hasn't produced a GPU in over a decade. This is gonna be good. As AIB partners do, the specs of this 6200 differ a bit from the ones produced by Nvidia, but I'll not be doing a side-by-side comparison and we'll just quickly go over the one I have from BFG Technologies. This card was built off the 110nm process and has a total of 77 million transistors. It has 4 render output units, 4 texture mapping units, 4 pixel shaders, 3 vertex shaders, supported up to DirectX 9, had 256 MB of DDR2 VRAM, and came with a core clock of 350 MHz and a memory clock of 266 MHz. This card was available in multiple interfaces including AGP, PCI, and PCIe. The one I have uses the PCI lane, but this does mean that the GPU does not support turbo cache. What is turbo cache, you ask? Well, it was similar to hypermemory by ATI, which allowed the graphics card to utilize some of the computer's system memory for VRAM instead, kinda like how IGPs do. In theory, it seems like a useful feature, but according to a few posts on Tom's Hardware, it doesn't seem like this feature was too popular with consumers. Back in the early 2000s, computers only had a few gigabytes of RAM at best, and stealing some of it for VRAM would have noticeably impacted the overall system performance for the worse. I still would have liked to use this feature though, since the system I'll be testing the GPU in has 8GB of RAM, which would be more than enough for any games we'll be testing, with plenty left over for the GPU to take full advantage of. I also learned that there was a Geforce 6200 as well as a Geforce 6200A and wanted to see what the difference between the two cards was. Overall, they were pretty similar, and the only difference I could really see is that the memory specs might have varied, but more importantly, the 6200A version of the card had an additional 2 ROPs. While researching the card, I also noticed that as of right now, it is the 4th slowest card on user benchmark, and its performance in that test is absolutely abysmal. I've never seen any device bench so horribly on this software, and the sheer incompetence of the GPU really set the bar low in terms of my expectations for it. Given this, I knew that I wouldn't need a powerful computer to run the GPU with, which leads me to the next section. Let's talk about the test system for today's video. Just about any PC that I would plug the 6200A in would be bottlenecked by said graphics card, so that wasn't really a concern, and the only hiccup I ran into was locating the correct expansion slot. Originally, the test system I was going to use this card in was one you've likely seen a few times on the channel with a Phenom 9550, but that motherboard didn't have any PCI slots, so I instead used another one of my test systems which had an Intel Q6600 in it. Originally, the system in question was sold as an OEM build by Dell as the Inspiron 530. It came with the quad-core 2.4 GHz Intel Q6600, 4GB of DDR2 RAM clocked to 800 MHz, and a 7200 RPM 500GB hard drive. Although this pre-built was released back in 2007, the Q6600 is still a decent, albeit low-end processor that can get away with some decent gaming in 2020. But I did upgrade the RAM from 4GB to 4 2GB sticks of DDR2 and installed a new hard drive into the system, since when I got the computer, one was not included. With all these upgrades and my personal experience with this computer, it's safe to say that the configuration rendered the 6200A the bottleneck of the system, so that shouldn't be too much of an issue in the test conducted in this video. That's just about all the background info one would need to know about this card, so how about we get right into some benchmarking for this GPU. The first thing I did was to try and find the best drivers for the graphics card, which I did by comparing the performance of the Microsoft Display Adapter drivers to the performance of the proper 6200A drivers. The first game I tested was Counter-Strike 1.6, and with all the lowest settings at 480p, the average frame rate was 4 FPS. However, that was with the OpenGL renderer, and when I switched to the software renderer, the frame rate became very smooth. I can't get exact numbers for that though, as MS Afterburner decides to stop working when you switch to the software renderer. But when I was done with that test and switched to the other drivers, there was no noticeable performance difference. The next driver test I did was with a more modern game, Turmoil. It's a pretty pretty basic, easy to run game, so I expected good performance, but I still ran it with all the lowest settings in 720p. After a few minutes of gameplay, the average frame rate came to be 15 FPS, and once again, switching the drivers didn't really impact performance. The last game I tested on both these drivers was Terraria, another modern-ish, easy to run game. I played it in a resolution of 800 by 600 with all the lowest settings, and the average frame rate came to be a meager 16 FPS. Similar to the last two comparisons, switching drivers didn't really influence the frame rates. Although there was no noticeable difference between the two, I still ran the remainder of the test on the official 6200A graphics drivers, so let's get right into it. With the driver testing out of the way, I then wanted to see how the card would fare in a test involving basic operating system usage. This includes dragging a few windows around and video playback, both of which the GPU did decently at. Dragging around applications felt smooth and general system interaction felt snappy enough. Video playback was a bit of a different story though. In 1080p, the experience was pretty laggy, and dropping the resolution down to 720p performed noticeably better. It could still slow down in some places though, so I dropped the resolution down to 480p where it performed the best out of all. Still, I'd say the 720p was the best of both worlds in terms of resolution, quality, and frame rates. Now on to the gaming benchmarks. I knew that performance of this card was going to be abysmal at best, and it really limited the quality and age of games that I could run on it. Given this, the first test I did on this system was of Just Cause from all the way back in 2006. The minimum system requirements cited GeForce 7600 GT, a more powerful graphics card than the 6200A GPU in question, and running the game under its minimum requirements didn't go too well. With all the lowest settings and resolution of 480p, the average frame rate resulted in 9 FPS, definitely unplayable. That test didn't go so well, so I took testing back to an older game, Quake 2, from back in 1997. After a few minutes, the average frame rate was only 23 FPS. Now, I know what you're thinking. What the actual fuck? Why did this game run so poorly? I mean, the system requirements for this game cite a 1MB graphics card, and the 6200A literally has 256 times the amount of VRAM. Yeah, I don't know why it performed so badly either, but I was using the Steam version and ran it with all the settings maxed out, since whenever I tried to change them, the game would crash. Most likely, the diminished performance was because I was running it on Windows 10, but there'll be more on that later. I then played one of 1998's very popular titles, Half-Life. When I first launched it, I was using OpenGL as the renderer and got an average of 6 FPS. However, with the software renderer, the frame rate was significantly smoother. Just note that in both situations, I ran the game in 480p with all the lowest settings. Also, this became a common occurrence in many games where the software renderer performed much better than the alternative. Sticking with these older games, I ran Serious Sam: The First Encounter. This game debuted in 2001 and its requirements were well under what was available to the computer. Similar to Quake 2, the game crashed whenever I tried to alter the settings and ultimately forced me to run it with the default settings of 480p and a mixture of custom settings. Still though, this game actually resulted in one of the better tests conducted on the system and achieved an average frame rate of 32 FPS. The following game ran with this graphics card was Unreal Tournament, another classic. When I launched the game, I automatically set itself to the highest settings, which did not run so well, so I lowered all the settings and switched to the software renderer where the frame rate became smooth. It was completely playable, ran great, and could be well utilized in a competitive environment. There were 3 more successful gameplay tests I did in this computer, one of them being Far Cry 1. Now, this game should have ran better than it ultimately did, especially in a resolution of 800 by 600 and all the lowest settings, but after a few minutes of gameplay, the average frame rate was 16 FPS. So, this test, like others performed on this card, didn't go so well. Another game I ran was Call of Duty 2. For whatever reason, the single player refused to start, so I instead loaded up a random multiplayer map and flew around a bit in the spectator mode. There wasn't much to do here, so I kinda just looked around at the scenery and such. After a minute or so of senseless meandering, the average frame rate was 15 FPS. Once again, unplayable. The last successful game I played on this computer was Doom 2. As always, for literally every computer I've ever tested the game on, Doom 2 ran great and performed very well, but this was to be expected. The last benchmark done on this computer was a failed one in Grand Theft Auto 3. For this game, I can get to the loading screen, but when it came time to display the menus, the whole game would crash. Oddly enough, it didn't even display an error message, unlike the 12MB of VRAM warning I got in the external GPU video, but maybe this was a good thing since this means that it was actually detecting the VRAM. So that's how the Nvidia 6200A holds up over a decade later in 2020. Theoretically, some of these games should have performed better than they ultimately did, and the lesser performance could be attributed to a variety of factors. The main issue likely was that it was running Windows 10 on the test computer, which is much more intensive than the older operating system most of the computer's hardware was intended for. This probably caused compatibility problems in games as well as driver and API issues. Maybe if I was running an older OS, such as Windows XP or Windows 7, the performance would have been better, but I didn't. Another potential and semi-related issue could have been that the CPU bottlenecked the performance. In some of the gaming tests, the Q6600 can be seen in the upper 90s in terms of utilization percentage, but I seriously doubt this impacted the gameplay performance. As I stated earlier in the video, the Q6600 is a very capable processor even in 2020 and can run games such as Grand Theft Auto 5 pretty decently. It is a quad-core processor though, and many of the tested games released back when dual-core was considered high-end, so there could have been a hardware to software compatibility issue there too. However, the point of this video was to see how the 6200A holds up in 2020, and in 2020, I'd like to think that most of us use capable hardware with a recent version of Windows, but I've little doubt that if I were to run this card with an older computer with hardware and an operating system more appropriate for the 2004 timeframe which this GPU released, that some of the games might have performed better. However, I'm not going to do that, probably. And one last thing before you go, would you like exclusive videos and unreleased footage with behind the scenes look into the channel? Well, then join the Discord, link in description. Regardless, regardless, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, please leave a comment below because interactions with viewers will help boost this video in the YouTube algorithm, and I guarantee that I'll respond to your comments. While you're at it, please subscribe because it helps a lot in video quality and production and also positively affects my day. Finally, leave any questions or suggestions in the comments below, and have a great day. Bye.